The king's decree. I remember the day everything changed as if it were yesterday. The castle courtyard was alive with the whispers of the court, a symphony of hushed voices that carried the weight of shock, fear, and betrayal. It wasn't every day that a king, a man so revered he seemed untouchable, would send his queen, his beloved wife, to a nunnery. But that's exactly what happened. I had been a humble servant in the castle, little more than a shadow that flitted between rooms unnoticed, yet privy to conversations that were never meant for my ears. That was how I first learned of the king's decision. A decree whispered in the dead of night to his most trusted advisors. Queen Isabel, the kindest woman I had ever known, was to be banished from the court, sent away to live a life of penance for reasons no one dared to question aloud. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she had displeased the king, others whispered of political machinations, but no one dared speak of the truth. 2 days later, as the sun broke over the horizon, I stood among the crowd in the courtyard, watching as the queen was led away. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She walked with her head held high, her back straight, and her hands clasped tightly in front of her, a picture of quiet dignity. The royal guards flanked her, their swords glinting in the morning light as the gates of the castle closed behind her. I thought that would be the last we would see of Queen Isabel. But I was wrong. It was her sisters, Ilara and Seraphine, who refused to let her story end there. Ilara was the older of the two, a woman of sharp wit and unyielding determination. Seraphine, younger by 5 years, was softer in demeanor, but possessed a quiet strength that belied her gentle nature. They were as different as night and day, yet united in their love for their sister. The news of Isabel's banishment reached them within hours, carried by a messenger who rode through the night to deliver the king's decree. I was there when they received it, standing at the edge of the great hall as the sisters read the words aloud. By order of King Cedric, Queen Isabel is hereby relieved of her royal duties and shall take residence at the Abbey of St. Liliana, where she will dedicate her life to prayer and reflection. Ilara's hands trembled as she held the parchment, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Seraphine stood beside her, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "This cannot be," Ilara whispered, her voice shaking with fury. "Isabel has done nothing wrong." Seraphine placed a hand on her sister's arm, her voice soft but firm. "We don't know why the king has done this, but we cannot let it stand." Ilara's gaze hardened, and she turned to her sister with a resolve that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're right. We won't." What followed was a flurry of activity as the sisters prepared to leave for the abbey. They refused to waste a moment, knowing that time was not on their side. The king's word was law, and the longer Isabel remained at the nunnery, the harder it would be to bring her back. I was assigned to their service for the journey, tasked with tending to their horses and ensuring their provisions were in order. I was glad for the opportunity, not only because it meant escaping the suffocating atmosphere of the castle, but also because I believed in their cause. Queen Isabel had been a beacon of kindness in a court filled with scheming nobles, and I couldn't stand the thought of her being cast aside like this. We set out at dawn, the sisters riding side by side with their heads held high, their determination as unyielding as the mountains that loomed in the distance. The journey to the abbey was long and arduous, but they never faltered. Each night as we made camp, I listened as they spoke of their plans. Ilara was adamant that they confront the king upon their return, demanding answers and justice. Seraphine, ever the peacemaker, suggested a more measured approach, seeking to understand the reasons behind his actions before taking any drastic steps. "It isn't just about Isabel," Seraphine said one evening, her voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. "It's about what kind of king Cedric wants to be. If he can cast her aside so easily, what does that say about his rule? About his heart?" Ilara's jaw tightened, and she stared into the flames with a fierce intensity. "Then we'll remind him of who he used to be. Before the crown, before the court. He wasn't always like this." Their words stayed with me as we traveled, a reminder that this was not just a fight for their sister, but a fight for something greater: justice, compassion, and the soul of the kingdom itself. When we finally reached the abbey, the sight of Queen Isabel brought tears to my eyes. She was dressed in the simple robes of a novice, her once elaborate braids now loose around her shoulders. Yet even in her humility, she carried herself with the grace of a queen. The reunion between the sisters was both heartwarming and heart-wrenching. Ilara embraced Isabel tightly, her voice breaking as she whispered, "We're here to bring you home." But Isabel shook her head, a soft, sad smile on her lips. "You shouldn't have come. The king's word is final." "Not if we can help it," Seraphine said, her eyes shining with determination. "You don't belong here, Isabel. This isn't your place." Isabel's gaze softened, and for a moment I saw the flicker of hope in her eyes. But then she lowered her head, her voice barely audible. "It's not so simple. If you fight for me, you'll make enemies you can't afford to have. The king is not the man we once knew." Ilara stepped forward, her voice firm. "Then it's time someone reminded him of who he is. And who you are." As we prepared to leave the abbey, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sisters' courage. They were walking into the lion's den, challenging a king who held absolute power. But they weren't doing it for themselves. They were doing it for their sister, for justice, and for a kingdom that deserved better. And as I mounted my horse, ready to follow them back to the castle, I realized that this was more than a journey. It was a battle for the soul of the realm. The sisters' resolve. The ride back to the castle felt heavier, not because of the miles stretched before us, but because of the gravity of what lay ahead. The sisters sat tall in their saddles, their expressions unreadable, but I could sense the turmoil swirling beneath their calm exteriors. As for me, I followed a few paces behind, wondering what would await us when we returned. The castle had always felt like a place of grandeur, with its towering walls and endless halls, but now it felt like a fortress of shadows. The king's decree loomed over us like a storm cloud, threatening to pour its wrath on anyone who dared question his authority. Ilara and Seraphine were undeterred. If anything, their resolve had only hardened since our visit to the abbey. Seeing Isabel in those plain robes, stripped of her dignity, had ignited a fire within them that would not be extinguished. Ilara turned to Seraphine as we crested a hill overlooking the castle. "When we confront him, we must be united. No hesitation, no cracks in our armor." Seraphine nodded, her voice soft but firm. "I understand. But Ilara, we must tread carefully. This isn't just about Isabel. It's about the future of the kingdom." Ilara's jaw tightened. The future of the kingdom begins with justice. If the king believes he can cast aside those who love and support him, then what hope do his people have? I didn't dare speak, but their words echoed in my mind. They weren't just fighting for their sister. They were fighting for something far greater. A kingdom where compassion outweighed cruelty, where power didn't come at the cost of integrity. The courtroom confrontation. When we arrived at the castle, the air was thick with tension. The court had gathered in the great hall, a sprawling room with high vaulted ceilings and tapestries that told the stories of kings long past. The courtiers, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, whispered amongst themselves as the sisters strode in, their heads held high. I lingered near the back, keeping to the shadows as I always did. It was safer there, away from prying eyes and the sharp tongues of nobles who looked down on anyone without a title. But even from my vantage point, I could feel the weight of the moment. The king sat upon his throne, his expression stern and unyielding. King Cedric had always been a man of power, his presence commanding respect, but today there was something different about him. He looked tired, as though the weight of his crown had grown too heavy to bear. Ilara and Seraphine approached the throne with a confidence that seemed to shake the very foundation of the hall. "Your Majesty," Ilara began, her voice strong and clear, "we come before you not as your subjects, but as your family. We demand an explanation for your actions against Queen Isabel." The court fell silent, every eye turning to the king. His gaze hardened, his voice cold as he replied, "My decisions are not up for debate. The queen's actions warranted her removal, and I will not justify myself to anyone." Seraphine stepped forward, her tone gentler but no less determined. "Brother, we do not seek to defy you, but we cannot stand by while you cast aside the woman who has stood by your side through every trial. Isabel has done nothing to deserve this." Cedric's expression faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "She defied the expectations of a queen," he said, his voice rising. "Her compassion makes her weak, her kindness a liability. This kingdom requires strength, not sentimentality." Ilara's eyes blazed with fury. "Strength is not the absence of kindness, Cedric. Strength is having the courage to lead with compassion, to rule with integrity. If you believe that casting aside those who love you is a sign of power, then you are not the king this kingdom needs." The court erupted into murmurs, the boldness of her words sending shockwaves through the room. But Ilara did not waver. The king's vulnerability. For the first time, I saw cracks in the king's armor. Cedric leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his throne, his voice trembling with anger. "You speak of things you do not understand, Ilara. Do you think I wanted to send her away? Do you think I enjoy the burden of this crown?" The room fell silent once more. Cedric's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his confession. Seraphine took a step closer, her voice soft, but filled with emotion. "Then why, Cedric? Why did you do this? If you love her, why banish her?" The king's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked less like a ruler and more like a man burdened by his own decisions. "Because I am afraid," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that my kindness will be seen as weakness. Afraid that if I allow myself to love, I will lose control of this kingdom. Isabel, she reminds me of who I used to be, before the crown, before the court, and I cannot afford to be that man anymore." A turning point. Ilara's expression softened, but her resolve did not waver. "Cedric, the man you used to be is the man this kingdom needs. You were not crowned to rule with fear. You were crowned to inspire, to lead with wisdom and heart. Isabel's compassion is not a weakness. It is her strength, and it can be yours too, if you let it." The king's gaze shifted, his eyes meeting Ilara's for a long, tense moment. Then, slowly, he rose from his throne, his figure towering over the room. "You speak with passion, sister," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But passion alone does not rule a kingdom." Seraphine stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "No, Cedric, but love does, and you cannot lead without it." The decision. The king stood there, silent and still, as if weighing their words against the weight of his crown. The court held its breath, the tension in the room palpable. Finally, Cedric spoke. "Very well. Bring Isabel back to the castle. If she still wishes to stand by my side, I will not stop her." The hall erupted into a mix of gasps and cheers, the sisters' victory resonating through the walls of the castle. I watched as Ilara and Seraphine exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. Their fight was not over. Not yet. But this was a start. As we left the great hall, I couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. The sisters had done what no one else had dared to do. They had reminded the king of the man he once was. And as we prepared to return to the abbey, I realized that this wasn't just a story about two sisters fighting for their sibling. It was a story about the power of love, the courage to stand up for what is right, and the belief that even the hardest of hearts can change. The journey back to hope. The journey back to the abbey was not just a physical one. It was a journey into the heart of their cause. Ilara and Seraphine rode side by side, their faces calm, but I could see the fire burning in their eyes. They had faced the king and secured his promise, but the battle was far from over. Promises, after all, were fragile things, easily broken by fear or doubt. I rode behind them, the reins of my horse slack in my hands, lost in thought. The sisters had accomplished what I had thought impossible. They had stood before the most powerful man in the kingdom and made him question himself. But the road ahead still felt uncertain, fraught with the weight of what might go wrong. Would Isabel even want to return? Could she forgive the man who had sent her away? The air was cool as we rode through the dense forest that surrounded the abbey, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The sound of our horses' hooves on the dirt path was the only noise, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. As the abbey came into view, a hush fell over us, and I felt the weight of what we were about to do settle over my shoulders like a heavy cloak. The reunion. When we reached the abbey, the sisters dismounted with a sense of urgency, their movements quick and precise. I followed close behind as they approached the gate, my hands trembling slightly as I knocked on the heavy wooden door. It opened with a slow creak, revealing the solemn-faced nun who regarded us with quiet curiosity. "We're here to see Isabel," Ilara said, her voice firm but polite. The nun nodded, stepping aside to let us in. The abbey was as quiet as I remembered, its stone walls cool and unyielding. The scent of incense hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly baked bread. As we were led through the halls, I couldn't help but notice the serene expressions on the faces of the nuns we passed. This was a place of peace, but for Isabel, it had been a prison. When we entered the small garden where Isabel was tending to a bed of flowers, she looked up in surprise, her hand still clutching the spade she had been using. Her expression shifted from shock to disbelief to something I couldn't quite place, a mixture of hope and fear. "Ilara, Seraphine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The sisters rushed to her, wrapping her in a tight embrace. For a moment, none of them spoke, their emotions too overwhelming for words. I stood back, giving them their space, but I couldn't stop the lump that formed in my throat at the sight of their reunion. "We've come to take you home," Ilara said finally, pulling back to look Isabel in the eyes. "Cedric has agreed to let you return." Isabel's face fell, and she took a step back, shaking her head. "I can't go back," she said, her voice trembling. "Not after what he's done. Not after he sent me away." "Isabel," Seraphine said gently, taking her hands in hers. "He made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But he's willing to make it right. He's willing to try. Isn't that worth something?" Isabel turned away, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know if I can forgive him." The burden of forgiveness. The words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and unyielding. I could see the pain in Isabel's eyes, the struggle within her as she grappled with the idea of returning to the man who had betrayed her. Forgiveness was not an easy thing, especially when the wound was still fresh. Ilara stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Isabel, I know it's not fair to ask this of you. I know what Cedric did was wrong, and you have every right to stay here if that's what you want. But think of what your return could mean, not just for you, but for the kingdom. If Cedric can learn to lead with compassion, if he can become the king we all know he's capable of being, it will be because of you." Isabel turned back to her sister, her expression unreadable. "And what if he doesn't change? What if I go back, and nothing is different?" "Then you'll have done everything you could," Seraphine said softly, "and that will be enough." The decision. For a long moment, Isabel said nothing. She stood there, her gaze fixed on the flowers at her feet, her hands trembling at her sides. The silence was unbearable, each second stretching into an eternity as we waited for her answer. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I'll go back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But not for Cedric, for the people, for the kingdom." Ilara and Seraphine embraced her again, their relief palpable. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a sense of hope washing over me like a wave. The first step had been taken, but the journey was far from over. The road back. As we made our way back to the castle, The mood was somber but determined. Isabel rode between her sisters, her expression calm but her eyes distant. I could only imagine what she was thinking, what fears and doubts she was wrestling with as we approached the gates. When we arrived, the castle seemed to hold its breath. The guards stood at attention, their faces unreadable, as we entered the courtyard. The courtiers who had gathered watched in silence as Isabel dismounted, her steps steady and deliberate as she approached the great hall. The king was waiting for her. He stood at the far end of the hall, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. As Isabel entered, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on her as she walked toward him. The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating, the air heavy with unspoken words. When she reached him, she stopped, her gaze meeting his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging between them like a wall. Finally, Cedric broke the silence. "Isabel," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I was wrong." The words seemed to echo through the hall, their impact reverberating in the stillness. Isabel's eyes widened slightly, and I saw a flicker of emotion cross her face. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. "I let fear guide my actions," Cedric continued. "I let the weight of the crown blind me to what truly matters. You didn't deserve what I did to you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, if you'll let me." For a moment, Isabel said nothing. The room held its breath, waiting for her response. Then, slowly, she stepped closer, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "I'll stay," she said, "but only if you prove to me and to the people that you're willing to change, that you're willing to lead with your heart, not just your crown." Cedric nodded, his expression solemn. "I will. I swear it." As the court erupted into murmurs, I felt a sense of hope swell within me. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning, a chance for the kingdom to heal, and for love and compassion to guide its future. A kingdom transformed. In the weeks that followed Isabel's return, the castle felt as though it had come alive again. Whispers of hope began to replace the echoes of fear that had lingered in the halls for so long. The queen's presence seemed to radiate light, and though she moved quietly, every corner of the court felt her influence. King Cedric, true to his word, began making changes. At first, they were small, attending council meetings with an open mind, listening more than speaking. But over time, the changes became more profound. He reinstated advisors who had once been cast out for challenging him. He opened his doors to petitions from the common folk, hearing their grievances and offering solutions. And most notably, he sought Isabel's counsel in matters of the heart and state. The court watched in stunned silence as Cedric and Isabel stood side by side at events and gatherings, their unity a symbol of reconciliation. But it wasn't just a performance. Slowly but surely, Cedric began to lean on her in ways he never had before, recognizing the strength in her compassion and the wisdom in her gentleness. It wasn't easy. Cedric stumbled, made mistakes, and faced opposition from those who clung to the old ways. But each time he faltered, Isabel was there to steady him, and Ilara and Seraphine were there to remind him of the man he wanted to be. Part 5. The Sisters' Legacy. Months turned into years, and the kingdom began to flourish under the renewed leadership of Cedric and Isabel. It wasn't just their bond that grew stronger. Their changes rippled out into the farthest reaches of the realm. The people began to trust their king again, not because he wielded power, but because he wielded kindness. Roads were repaired, famine-stricken villages received aid, and the walls of the castle no longer felt like barriers between the rulers and the ruled. As for Ilara and Seraphine, they too found their roles in this new chapter. Ilara became a trusted advisor to the king, her sharp mind and unyielding resolve ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Seraphine, with her gentle touch and gift for diplomacy, worked to heal the fractures in the court, bridging divides that had long seemed insurmountable. But it was not just their deeds that left an impact. It was their courage, their love for their sister, and their belief that even the most powerful could change. The final test. One day, as the first snow of winter dusted the castle grounds, a messenger arrived at the gates with urgent news. A neighboring kingdom had declared war, claiming a border dispute as their justification. The court erupted into chaos, and Cedric's advisors called for swift retaliation. But Cedric hesitated. "Violence should never be our first answer," he said, his voice steady but uncertain. He turned to Isabel, Ilara, and Seraphine, his eyes searching theirs for guidance. The sisters stood together, a united front, and it was Seraphine who spoke first. "Let us try diplomacy before we draw swords. War is easy to start but difficult to end." Ilara nodded in agreement. "We've seen what happens when leaders rule with fear. Let us show them the strength of a kingdom built on unity and compassion." Isabel stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Cedric. "This is your chance to prove that you are the king we all believe you can be. Show them that power is not in the blade, but in the hand that extends peace." Cedric took a deep breath, their words settling over him like a mantle. He nodded. "We will try peace." The decision was risky, and many doubted it would work. But the sisters, each in their own way, played their part. Seraphine brokered talks with the enemy's envoys. Ilara devised strategies to protect the kingdom should the negotiations fail, and Isabel stood by Cedric's side, reminding him of the man he had become. When the envoys returned with an agreement for peace, the court erupted into cheers. The kingdom had been spared the horrors of war, and Cedric's decision was hailed as an act of true leadership. A new era. As the years passed, the story of the sisters and their fight for Isabel became legend. They were remembered not just for their bravery, but for their belief in the power of love, forgiveness, and the possibility of change. Cedric, now an older and wiser king, often reflected on the day his sisters stood before him in the great hall. It had been their courage, their refusal to give up on him, that had set him on a new path. And it had been Isabel's strength, her grace, that had taught him what it truly meant to rule. The kingdom flourished in ways it never had before, its people united under a leadership that valued heart as much as it did strategy. And though the sisters eventually went their separate ways, Ilara leading campaigns for justice in the far reaches of the realm, Seraphine founding schools for peacebuilding, and Isabel remaining by Cedric's side, their bond remained unbreakable. The kingdom's legacy. Years later, when the first snow of winter once again blanketed the castle grounds, a young girl stood before the statue of three women in the courtyard. She looked up at their faces, Isabel, Ilara, and Seraphine, her eyes wide with wonder. Who were they? She asked her mother, who stood beside her. They were the sisters who changed everything, her mother replied with a smile. They fought not with swords, but with their hearts. They taught a kingdom to believe in hope, even when it seemed impossible. The girl nodded, her gaze fixed on the statue as snowflakes danced around her. And as the bells of the castle rang out, their chimes carrying across the kingdom, it was clear that the legacy of the sisters, their courage, their love, their unyielding belief in what was right, would never be forgotten. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.